Recall that we said arrays have a pretty big problem, and that is that when we create an array, so if we do something like int a equals, let's turn down my mouse sensitivity, if we do int a equals new int of, let's say, 10, then the problem is that we can't change how many elements a can store. Okay? So a will forever point to somewhere in memory where there is a slot for 10 elements. Okay? And there's no way to ever add or remove, or rather change the capacity of a. Okay? And the big issue is, what if we don't know a priori or in advance how many elements we will need to store? So, I mean, this is a pretty common problem with, many things. So, for example, like if you're processing data or records from a file or just some other data source, you may not know how many records you have to process. So, that's a pretty big limitation. So, fortunately, Java has something called an array list. So, what is the difference between an array list versus an array? Well, there are some pretty big differences, and for starters, we'll talk about how to create one. So, if we want to create an array of integers, we might do something like this. Okay? If we want to create an array list, we're going to do something as follows. So I'll type it out, and then I'll specify what everything means. Okay, so let's zoom in and let's examine what we've done here. So, what is going on here is we already know what the new keyword does. It just means that we're going to create a new distinct instance, as it's called, of something called an array list. But what's a little odd is that you may think, well, why don't we put array list over here instead of just list? Well, there are a couple reasons for that, but I will come back to that once I first talk about what this is. So, with an array, we know what type of element it stores because we say it before we put the brackets. Here, we have to say what the type of the list is going to be inside of these angle brackets. Okay? So these things, or this thing in general, is called a type parameter. Okay? And all that means is that we can specify what type of element we're going to put in our array list. So, the difference here is that while we can create arrays out of primitives, so we can do like char, we can do double, we can do boolean, we can do int, the problem is that we cannot do that with a list or an array list. So for now, I'm going to say arrays and array lists, lists and array lists are the same thing, and I'll talk about the distinction momentarily. But what we can't do is something like this. This is not allowed, and the reason why is because anything that we put as a type parameter must be a reference type. And we've talked about that before, right? So we said that there are two types. There's primitives versus reference types. And we already know what the primitives are. Those are int, char, double, boolean, and some others. But everything else, including strings, arrays, array lists, and everything else, these are all reference types. You also might call them objects. Okay? And as I keep saying, we'll come back to the meaning and the significance of object, but for now, just know that if you want to put something like a primitive in your, as a type, like if you want to have an array list that stores a primitive type, we have to use something called the wrapper classes. So we know that we've actually been using the wrapper classes a little bit. We've been using integer and double. So what are these classes? And I'll write them all out just to clarify. But a wrapper class, or at least the wrapper classes for the primitives, are classes or reference types that wrap a corresponding primitive. So each of these correspond to a primitive data type. Okay? And we have to use these. We have to use one of these four if we want to have an array list of ints or doubles or chars or booleans. Okay? So that's a pretty easy thing to avoid doing because the compiler will not let you, but just be aware of that. Okay? Now, there's another thing that we didn't do when we created an array list. We didn't specify the size. We didn't put a size here, or we didn't put a size anywhere. The thing is, when we create an array list, it's going to initialize a list to a predetermined size. We don't need to say how many elements are going to be stored in the array list, because what the array list will do is what's called dynamically resize. Okay? So when an array list meets its capacity, or when we fill it to its capacity, it will resize itself. And what that really means, I'll talk about in the next video. Okay? But that's why we can do certain things like we can add elements to an array list, but we can't do that with an array which has a fixed capacity. Okay? What I mean is that an array list will expand its capacity at runtime. Okay? Good. So there's one more thing that I want to come back to, and that is why list versus array list. Like, what is the distinction here? Well, the distinction is that array lists are a kind of, so array lists are a kind of list. So what that means is that an array list will behave like a list, okay? And there are other kinds of lists as well. And we'll talk about at least one of those in our next section. But for now, just know that we do this for, like, the reason why we say a list whatever equals new array list is because we want to be as generic, or general, sorry, let me be careful with my word there. We want to be as general as possible. Because when we start introducing other kinds of lists, we will always want to use the most general kind of thing on the left and the more specific thing on the right. Okay? And there is some more significance to this. I know I keep saying that, but for now, just know that you should always put list on the left-hand side and then array list on the right-hand side. You cannot do list blah equals new list. That's not allowed by the compiler. Now you can do array list blah equals new array list. That is fine, and is the way some people teach the class. But at least with the way that I'm going to do things, you should always use the most specific, or the most general thing on the left and the more specific thing on the right. Okay? So, and when you see problems, for example, on your lab or on the next problem set, you'll see that the signatures are always like return a list rather than return a, or return an array list. Okay? Good.